let's move on to the last talk of our session. It's my pleasure to introduce Mark Haacke from Wayne State, and he's gonna give a talk on building a collaborative partnership with research hospitals in China from inception to publication. Please, Mark, we're looking forward to your talk. Mark, you're muted.
All right, there we go. Thank you also to the other speakers for their interesting presentations. And so I had to go back and dig up an old slide here that I thought would be appreciated by Stephen here, but hopefully also by all of you. So this is from an interesting contest that the ISMRM had, where they asked the previous presidents to go and get a 3D high resolution scan. And then they posted this up at the ISMRM when the contest was, who could identify all the presidents? Now, when they did that, of course, they were all mixed up and there were no years associated with them. And I'm not sure you can tell, you know, I usually enjoy my talks, so I'm smiling right now. And back in 1994, I must have been smiling inside the magnet as well. So you can definitely recognize me from this. So that, you know, here we are, you know, 25 years later, but these have become, you know, very important issues. And so, you know, thank you everybody for your contributions to that. All right, so let's move on to building a collaborative partnership with research hospitals in China from inception to publications. And you know, I spend a lot of time in Shanghai these days, and this is a view over the Huangpujiang, and this is the Dapu Lu Chao. It's a bridge that they have beautifully colored in the night. The one thing I love about Shanghai is it's very colorful city and cosmopolitan city to be part of today. Okay, so motivation. The motivation for this talk, and I apologize to everybody, I'm in the wrong session, but hopefully you guys will enjoy this. I had to switch over because I don't think I could have been up around 2 in the morning when I was supposed to give my previous session. So this is about standardized neuroimaging. And so the key here is to define the problem, to look for potential sites who can collaborate with you, to create some standardized sequence that can be used, collect some preliminary data to evaluate what's possible at each of the sites. One of the most important parts here is also preparing a collaborative document that really outlines how you're going to work together. And then, of course, you have to arrange for really a one-on-one meeting and a group meeting, which we originally did a year ago to get started. Of course, everything's by Zoom today in China. And then, you know, consider potential funding mechanisms to keep the project going. And of course, as people have alluded to here related to data, have a data analysis center. And then hopefully down the road, a real opening day for this. So the problem that we want to address here is to explore a solution for using imaging biomarkers to address subcharacterizing movement disorders. That can include, of course, Parkinson's disease, essential tremor, multiple system atrophy, Lewy body disease, RBD, which is REM and sleep disorder related problems, which are early markers for potentially developing Parkinson's, PSP, and a number of other movement disorders. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of Parkinson's disease on a few slides before I go through all those details I showed you momentarily. And these biomarkers should be useful for helping not only with early diagnosis, but also with looking at the prediction and prognosis for patients before and after treatment. And the wonderful thing about MR today is it's really developing biomarkers to be able to do that. So we created this group called the Parkinson's Disease Imaging Consortium of China, or PDIC. And the overarching goal of this is to identify imaging biomarkers that correlate with movement disorder patients' clinical conditions and can be used to predict or follow treatment, whether by drugs or by deep brain stimulation. These potential biomarkers today include brain atrophy, 3D volumetrics, using free water changes in DTI, using neuronal functional changes with resting state fMRI, And our area of expertise is in measuring iron content using a method called STAGE, which I'll briefly discuss, and then also measuring neuromelanin content, which is using a 3D MTC STAGE-like protocol, which is a very exciting tool because you really have to use SPECT and PET today to really be able to monitor, the changes in dopaminergic neuronal function, except MR can now do neuromelanin. So really exciting. STAGE is actually just 2 SWI scans, in this case, multi-echo SWI scans run fairly quickly, just short TR scans, 3 echoes, but 2 flip angles. And the idea behind 2 flip angles allows us to extract the RF transmit and RF field inhomogeneities, and therefore correct the data. And it allows us to calculate a number of quantitative measures. So here's the idea. You collect a low flip angle, which is a spin density weighted image. You collect a high flip angle, which is a T1 weighted image. And those 2 images can generate about 15 types of contrast. So the idea is start off with the 2 contrasts. We can create what we call an enhanced T1 weighted image with this. You can do SWI with this. And you can create 4 different quantitative maps here. T1 mapping, QSM, spin density mapping, which is basically a measure of the water content, and R2 star mapping. You can also go and do simulated double inversion recovery experiments. You can simulate flare data and a number of other things like this. So it's a very powerful technology that today can be run fairly quickly. And most importantly, it can be run on any magnet. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So I'm going to start off showing you here some results of neuromelanin. This is using an MTC sequence. This is looking at neuromelanin in the locus ceruleus. And just to show you what happens as you vary the flip angle here, you can see that the contrast is changing quite considerably with the CSF and where the locus ceruleus is. And finally, by the larger flip angles, now you have more iso-intense background white matter with the locus ceruleus showing up. And we call this the red-eyed bamboo tree frog sign. This was actually a front cover of NeuroImage last fall. And it's really a nice demonstration of what's possible using 3D MTC imaging. And we can do the same thing for the neuromelanin in the substantia nigra as well. So again, the same idea as we look through these different contrasts, we can get very nice white matter neuromelanin contrasts at the lower flip angles. But if we want to suppress most of the other tissues, we can go to a 30-degree flip angle, and then we tend to see mostly just the neuromelanin component associated with this. If you take the boundary associated with this neuromelanin and you overlay that boundary onto a QSM image, you can see that there's only a partial overlay with the substantia nigra. And this inner portion is called the substantia nigra pars compacta. The outer portion is the pars reticulata. And that's because the neuromelanin is only in the SNPC. And you also see it in the ventral tegmental area as well. So what's important about this and what's very exciting about this is that we can take all these MTC neuromelanin boundaries, we can overlay them onto the QSM boundaries, and then we can march down here and look at what happens from the most caudal slices and then go up higher and higher. So most caudally, it's SNPC, and then in the superior portion, it's mostly SNPR. So this is very important because there's something called the N1 sign today. The N1 sign is a quick and dirty way without quantitatively looking at the data to see if the neuromelanin is present in the N1 territory. And so here, if we look in the more caudal regions, you can see that the boundary of the neuromelanin shows a bright little dot here. And this is a very small example of it, but by overlaying the neuromelanin boundary, you can actually find this N1 sign. And hopefully most of us as normal controls have that N1 sign. So I'll show you that a little more clearly here. Here's a QSM image. Here's a long echo magnitude image. And then this is what we call the true SWI image. And you can see this loop structure very clearly here. So this is a bigger area than what I showed you in the previous case. This took 5 or 6 minutes to acquire this data with a resolution of roughly a cubic millimeter. The lower image is a gorgeous image from Massey et al. With 50 micron by 50 micron resolution. And they have clearly labeled all the different nigrosome territories. Here's the nigrosome 1, and nigrosome 1 again. And this only took 10 hours to collect, not too bad. So it's pretty amazing that we can come up with a similar type of image, which obviously much less resolution, but still showing us that same Niagara zone territory. So why is this valuable? Well, if you look at these different representations of the Niagara zone, they can be small loops, large loops. They can miss the bottom portion, and that's why it was originally called swallowtail. And so I'll show you an example of a 70-year-old here. Here you can see in the more caudal regions a clear representation of the N1 sign. And then in a Parkinson's disease patient, it's completely gone. And that's because in Parkinson's patients, 50% of the neuromelanin has already depigmented. That depigmented neuromelanin dumps its iron here into the substantia nigra because neuromelanin is an iron chelator. So when it depigments, the iron now appears here and you lose that N1 sign. So in a study that we did here on normal controls, we found we could see this N1 sign on 78 out of 80 people. And in Parkinson's patients, 2/3 of the patients show either a full loss of the nigrosome 1 side or at least a unilateral loss. However, about 1/3 of them still show this. So it's not the perfect marker, but it's one biomarker that can be used. The other biomarker is iron content. And in this plot, I show you how iron increases in the right substantia nigra as a function of age. And sadly, we all rust as we get older here, so we get more and more iron coming into our brain the older we get. So you need to be able to take into account the age-related effect of iron. And all these red represent Parkinson's disease. Now, they're not all above the 95% confidence interval. So again, iron is a suggestive marker, but it's still not the perfect marker. Now, this is a more interesting plot. This is a plot of neuromelanin volume versus the overlap fraction, the overlap with the substantia nigra. And here you can see the healthy controls are separating much better. So the healthy controls have a lot more neuromelanin. And supposedly, as I said before, that by the time you start showing Parkinson's symptoms, you end up with about 50% loss of neuromelanin. And we don't see quite that much loss, at least as measured by MRI. Those studies that showed this by Damier et al. Some 30 years ago were all done on cadaver brains. And so, we have a lot more cases to use here. And we find about a 30% loss. And so if you put all these biomarkers together, you can really do a very good job. You can get up to about an AUC of 95%. So it's very promising to be able to use all components of MR to do a better and better job. Okay, so let's go back to the collaboration idea. So one of the first things we want to do is to approach potential sites about collaboration. So which sites have similar interests to what you want to do? And that's actually practically very important. You could have a very good site, but they're not really interested in collaborating, for example. And that's life. Some people don't like to collaborate, some do. You also want to have sites that are really willing to work together and they have a good collegial attitude and are willing to share their data and share their thoughts. So that's very important. So I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time traveling around China, giving talks in a variety of different locations, all the way from the far southwest to the far northeast of China, including the middle parts like Shanghai and Beijing. So I've met a lot of people over the years, worked with different universities over the years. And so our goal was to basically establish a working group of 10 to 15 sites. And the goal is to collect at least 1,000 cases a year. And again, that takes a lot more travel to get 10 to 15 sites working for you here. I was actually very lucky and surprised in 2017 when, after I had given a presentation, they came up and gave me this award for expert with outstanding contributions. And the reason for that was partly because I've been going to China since 1985. So that's 30 years of spending time in China, and most Chinese sites know me these days. I even have a Chinese name now. It's Hai Jiao Shou, or Hai Ming De is my full name in Chinese. So I've had a lot of fun over the years in China, which makes it possible to bring these people together. So we also need to build working teams at these sites. So, it's not just having 1 or 2 people there. If you have a few sites where you can really bring the whole group together, that's very important. And here we managed to bring 2 groups together in Shanghai. This is Professor Yang Guang here from East China Normal University, and he has part of his team here. And this is Professor Yan Fuhua, who's head of the Chinese MR Society, Clinical Radiology MR Society, and she is chairman at Ruijin Hospital. And the other half of the group is from her group. And so we have this very large working group in Shanghai, and that's the center of our group. So you also have to have, a central location here as well. And then you need to prepare a standardized sequence for all sites and all manufacturers. And that's always been a challenge. That's been a 30-year challenge. In my history, if you ever proposed a grant using a Siemens and a GE scanner, well, they would come down very hard on you saying, well, you'll never be able to compare them across systems. That's probably still a problem today. And the reason I introduced you to STAGE was because we've now overcome that problem, or at least we believe we have. So the idea is to design, optimize, and test a standardized Parkinson's protocol that can be used at all sites. And then, of course, we need to test this with a traveling brain. And maybe some of you have seen a few papers called the Traveling Brain 1 and the Traveling Brain 2. That was not our group, but we did manage to have somebody go to 10 different sites, and I'll show you that in a moment. So this is the STAGE data where we collected the different contrasts. And here we're really interested in the QSM and the neuromelanin, so you can blow these up and get some very good quality images. And the question is, can I do this from site to site? So here's the first 7 sites we did. This is the same individual scanned with exactly the same protocol on all the magnets. So it didn't matter if it was a Philips or a Siemens, all 3T in this case. And of course, just visually, you might say, okay, these all look the same. Even the QSMs look amazingly the same. And I have a paper in review right now that is quantitatively comparing the water content, the T1 values, the T2 star values, the QSM values. And depending on whether or not you scan this individual 5 times on the same day, the errors are very small, then maybe 1 to 2%, because the guy's not moving. It's very easy to have reproducibility when you're just scanning the person again and again at the same spot at the same time. But moving them from magnet to magnet, that's a totally different story. So these errors are bigger then. They're more like 5, 6, 7%. And that comes from interpolation errors and a number of other things like this. But it's still quite impressive how you can, if a doctor viewed this data, he wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them. So the next thing is to prepare a document that allows the whole group to work as a team. And this is really critical because you have to have everything from data sharing agreements in place to the ideas that Stephen was talking about. If you're going to ever let this data get out of your hands, you have to deface it. You need publication agreements and all sorts of ground rules here to make people happy, because everybody has their own expectations in this process. So, 2 people is easy to work with, 3 is complicated, 3-body problem. In this case, the many-body problem. So this is the index for the document we created, and it has all of these different headings everywhere from publication policy to research design, all the way down to the clinical research forms that should be used in the evaluation of this data. And, this takes a lot of time to put together. I would say the whole organization to do this took a year by itself just to create this. And then, of course, you'd like to have an original group meeting. We managed to do that just pre-COVID. So we had an in-person meeting. The next goal was to establish regular monthly meetings, clear milestones for each of the groups and what could be done, and then determine which sites are responsible for which papers. And luckily, most sites often have their own unique things they like to do, but the critical issue is to have also a core assessment. So when we run the STAGE protocol for Parkinson's, that's the core protocol. But if they want to run something else on top of it, resting state, DTI, whatever else, they can certainly do that. And then, of course, funding mechanisms. If we're doing this in the US, there are things like U01 grants. There's also program project grants. In China, they have something called the National Key Laboratories, which is very similar to what we used to call center grants in the United States. If you can really demonstrate that you can work together as a team, then you have a chance to get one of these grants. And when you have your grants reviewed, if you're collaborating with somebody, you have to demonstrate you have published with them, right? Well, luckily, I've probably published more than 100 papers with these different sites over the last 5 or 10 years. And so that was also a good demonstration of how the groups can work together. And then you need to establish, of course, that data center. And you should really, I think, have once you start collecting lots of data, and we see all the problems that exist in data analysis and data sharing, you need a basically a systems manager for this type of environment, because all the sites will want to share the data, they'll all want to access it, and eventually, of course, maybe the rest of you will want to access it too once this gets established. And then prior to the opening day, of course, we should really begin formal data collaboration and make any final clarifications as far as the agreement is concerned and have these agreements signed. That's actually a bigger deal than you might imagine, because that requires not just maybe the PI signature, but the chairman's signature, maybe even the hospital's signature. Every location is different in how they view this and what they're willing to commit to. So all sorts of just human challenges that go into this. And over the years, as you can imagine, I really traveled all over China and gotten to know many of the people in China. And that's a big advantage when you're trying to create a group like this. And of course, during that process, I will admit I haven't always done business. I've tried to escape a little bit. This is Taiyuan. It's a very interesting city that has this tree that looks like it's fallen down. Is actually a 3,000-year-old tree. It's one of the oldest trees in China. And it's actually held up by what they call the sun tree, which is a mere 2,000 years old. And this final picture on the right-hand side is really a gorgeous example of what's called Apsaras angels in the Mogu grottos. This is from about 800 AD. And it's absolutely incredible, the artwork that's inside these caves, which was done mostly for religious reasons, but also sometimes for political reasons. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact either myself or Dr. Wu Bo in China. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. This is an incredibly complex effort. I cannot even think how many hours of work go into something like this. We have time for a couple of questions before we move over to the hands-on tutorial.
I just want to flag, I think the hands-on tutorial is in another session that maybe you have to enter through the lobby, just to know.
So maybe just one question to get started, to get a bit of an idea of the scale of the entire project. How much of a ground staff do you have on there at the different sites? Do you have dedicated administrative personnel that you are working with that go between the sites, or is it just individual people at the, what was it, 7 or 10 different sites that just sync among themselves and you are coordinating the entire thing? Or
that's a good question. I don't have specific funding for it at this point, but I do have a colleague, that's Dr. Bo Wu. He was the traveling brain, and he is the brains behind the Chinese brains behind bringing all of this together. So he has literally been to every site, probably 2 or 3 times over the last few years. He makes sure that things are set up correctly. He establishes the contacts, not just in radiology, but in neurology, because the biggest part of this, the research is often done by the radiologists, but the biggest part is the neurologists. If you don't have them on board, you won't be able to collect the data. And I will say we're extraordinarily lucky. In one site, we have over 200 cases so far. In another site, we have, in the last 3 years, collected over 800 cases. And these are really all just preliminary data at the moment. But it's given us a good idea of what some of the problems are in the process. And our goal is also to get a grant on this, because I agree with you, you're going to need to have some administrative staff, some technical staff who are just 100% dedicated to this project, especially once it starts taking shape. So hopefully we can do that next year.
I keep my fingers crossed for you. Yeah. Thank
you very much.
One question.
Florian, I'd make one last comment, is I did send to Francesco a voiceover version of this talk. So if anybody is interested in this, and not just in our session, but in any session, they're all welcome to a copy of those slides.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated. One question that came from the chat, actually from Francesco, and he was asking about how challenging is the data sharing aspect? I mean, both from a regulatory issue and maybe from legal issues from the different sites. Do you just collect all the data in one big repository and everybody of the sites can access it, or do the sites share among themselves, or is it centralized or distributed?
That is the last biggest challenge of all of them. So right now, most of the analysis is done within each individual hospital. And so the papers are often written out of those hospitals. Of course, Dr. Bo helps them. I help them in terms of the analysis and the writing of the papers. So we haven't yet 100% solved this central repository problem, because some hospitals don't want to share their data outside. It just depends on, every hospital is almost like its own unique town and has its own unique politics. So it really, you just have to deal with each site as it comes. But hopefully down the road, if we can, adopt a lot of things like Stephen has introduced here and make them feel very comfortable, the data is very safe, then hopefully we can get most of them to put it into the central repository. So yes, it's a big challenge.
Thank you so much. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Just one comment that Francesco made about uploading slides. He said, actually, there are plans to upload the talks on YouTube, on the ESMRMB's channel. So hopefully that will give each one of you additional exposure beyond the core conference here. Okay, I think this concludes our session. Thank you so much for all the speakers. Thank you to everybody who attended and everybody who asked questions. And we will now, I think we ran out of our social break, but we will head straight over to the hands-on tutorial. Please join it, stay with us, and that concludes our session. Thank you so much.